Our two colleagues, Аны Каманьо and Tommazo Agasisти, who will present their research on efficiency. I think as Tommaso is preparing now, he can be the first one. Okay, so there will be two quite long presentations by our colleagues, and after the break we will have presentation of our project results, three presentations from our colleagues. So in general, for those who doesn't know, at HSC University at the Institute of Education, We have the project on efficiency, performance, and impact of higher education institutions under the supervision of Tommazo Agasisти from Polytechnico di Milano. We started only 2 years ago, right? And we are trying to evaluate the impact of different policies at performance of higher education institutions, of compare efficiencies, productive functions, and trying to see as from the system level to the operational level, what is the difference between the university in terms of their performance. So I think we can start with the presentations, maybe.
Anna is our host, maybe she can start.
Yeah.
Would be okay for you?
Okay. So Аны Каманьо is from University of Porto, and she will give a speech on her recent research on performance of educational systems in Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to say that it's a privilege for me and an honor to be here at this conference, so I'd like to thank the invitation. And it's a great opportunity to be able to present research here. I understand this is mostly a focus of economics of education as well with quite a few contributions from sociology. And in this particular presentation, it stems from a more management science-oriented research, and in particular looking at quantitative techniques that could contribute to the evaluation of education systems. So it's more on a system level rather than on a university or more detailed level of contributions. So in particular, this research is an called on the University. We have also projects on efficiency and effectiveness of education. And here our aim was to compare the education systems in Europe with the main targets and strategy of the European countries for the 2020 target. So for it's coming, the 2020, but it was using data of 2015. So 5 years before the end of this period of evaluation, what would we say about the evolution of countries? So in terms of the presentation, what I'd like to do is to present the context, to explain why this research was relevant and what has led us to the research objectives, and explain how our research objectives are related with the literature in terms of country-level educational achievements, and then describe the methodology. So here is a little bit more on quantitative techniques to actually be able to appreciate and make the benchmarking of countries, and then describe the data and empirical findings. So in terms of the context, evaluating performance of education systems is definitely in the top of the agenda for most political agents, administrative agencies, as well as the responsible for universities and schools. However, most evaluations are based on individual indicators, and we try to assess how the indicators are evolving over time, or doing rankings on those individual indicators. The overview of performance is rarely easy to be addressed, and therefore this was our main task, to be able to see how we can actually summarize performance and be able to explain how things are evolving in terms of these measures that provide a robust and significant overview of education systems. Why hasn't this topic been addressed before, or at least it's very rare to be able to see research on this topic? First, because when we're talking about education systems, there is not comparable data available. Sometimes the data is collected in different countries following different methodologies. And also because the context of countries is different and their strategies might also be different. So this prevents widespread research in this area. However, in the case of the European space, we have very different countries with different agendas, but there is an agreement on what the overall view for Europe should be, and therefore it makes sense to compare them. On the other hand, there is also data sets from Eurostat that are also collected in the same way for all countries, so it would be possible to conduct these assessments. Apart from this type of framing of European level data, there are quite a few studies that look at PISA and TIMSS and PIRLS worldwide assessments, so that's more common to look, but that is focused on 15 years old achievements and specifically on academic achievements, so our attempt was slightly broader than the previous attempts to look at education systems. So in terms of the context for the European cooperation in education and training, they set a few strategic targets, and they are mostly related with lifelong learning. So it's different from academic achievements in the sense that it looks from early childhood into secondary education, tertiary education, as well as vocational education, and education throughout the working life of individuals. So the most important objectives, the way that were framed, is making lifelong learning and mobility a reality. So mobility, at least in the Erasmus program in Europe, is a very, very important issue, and internationalization of students and knowledge. Then it was also important to improve the quality and efficiency of education and training, promoting equity, social cohesion, and active citizenship, as well as entrepreneurship at all levels of education and training, and creativity and innovation. I see that all these topics are shared by almost all presentations here that I've seen. So it's always around these themes. So I think we are aligned in a worldwide view. But how can they actually be assessed? This is quite vague. This will be very difficult to actually monitor. So Europe has set a few targets, and these are the numbers that are actually monitored. And the targets for the education and training strategy refer to 7 issues, and only one of them, which is related with learning mobility, does not yet have data available, but they are collecting it, so we hope to have it in the future. The other target is related with the achievements, one of the targets, target number 6. It's related with the achievements in reading, maths, and science for 15 years old, and here the information is based on PISA. And the objective of the European Union was focused on low achievers. They expect to have very few low achievers, below 15% of the students that do these exams, because they think this is really, they must have better achievements to be able to have an engagement in society and to succeed and be happy in their lives. So they were very worried about this particular indicator, which is quite interesting because most of the studies that we see using PISA are focusing as well on top achievers and average classification, but for EU, the target was reduce low achievers. Then the other targets, we can see that they are quite broad. They range from adult participation in lifelong learning to employment rate of recent graduates, so here it's recognized the connection between education and working life. Then early childhood education and care, because it's believed that the education even at 5 years old or 4 years old, if they are properly engaged with their learning skills, then that means that they will have greater propensity of being successful in later studies. And then classic indicators, which is tertiary education attainment and early leavers from education and training. So they wanted to have tertiary education attainment as high as possible and the participation rate, that would be good. So if we look at these indicators, I'm just plotting here 2 of them, which is early leavers from education and training, which we want as low as possible, and tertiary education attainment we want as high as possible, and I'm drawing the horizontal line on the EU target. And we can see there is a wide range of variation in the countries, so the countries are listed in the x-axis, and we can see that it also evolves a lot over time. So I have 4 different markers representing different years. So the issue is, if just for 2 indicators, we can see really that it's very difficult to say something about how a country is evolving, or even saying how the country is evolving if we consider simultaneously the 7 indicators. This was our challenge. So this is where we started from. We have several indicators, we have things moving over time, we have several countries with different contexts. How can we do to do a fair comparison and actually promote improvements in the countries, which we don't want just to measure for the sake of saying who's better, who's worse. We want to measure to be able to guide countries in their policies and then be able to help and say something on how they can improve. So in terms of the first objective, we would need to make a composite measure representing the overall education system. And this is something that is not new. It's very common to see this type of measures in ecology studies as well as in economic settings. For example, the United Nations Human Development Index, most people are aware, taking into account education, health, and economic status of the country. So again, 3 very different dimensions that must be aggregated to represent the country's development or human development index in the countries. Technology Achievement Index is also well known from the United Nations. Environmental Performance Index are also available. These are coming more from the literature, Climate Change Performance Index. But in terms of education, there are very few attempts to build a composite index. And here I will give particular attention to one of the, I think, best achieved in composite indices in the context of education, which was done in the Canadian Council by the Canadian Council on Learning. And in fact, they are looking at 5 pillars according to UNESCO's principles that education must encompass, to different ideas on how to know, which is what we learn at school, how or to do or to act properly in society relating with working skills, then to live together, which is learning in the community, and to be, which is learning at home or within the families. And for aggregating these 4 pillars, they've considered a few indicators, 17 indicators, and each of the indicators can then be measured by, or 17 indicators, and then they have measures to represent that indicator. It would be, for example, like in the PISA case, to see the achievements of 15 years old, we will have to consider maths, Portuguese, science, and the ability of writing, for example. So they aggregate all these indicators, and their idea is to be able to compare the Canadian regions and also consider sub-indicators individually, such that we know in which of these dimensions the regions are doing better. But the way that they have aggregated is more aligned, well, it's also quite innovative, so this is also quite interesting, because usually when we aggregate indicators, either we use fixed weights, or alternatively we go to experts and ask their view, and then aggregate with different weights based on the view of experts. Here they try to get a statistical procedure such that they would not have to get a consensus of experts, which is very difficult, but they would represent the importance of the indicator by seeing how much it impacts economic and social development. So they did structural equations modeling to see what the appropriate weights were, and then aggregating using those weights. So the idea was that then it's possible to visualize in the regions how these indicators, how well the regions are performing in terms of these, the grouped indicators, as well as how things are evolving over time. So it was something of this kind that we wanted to do as well for Europe, and the research that I'm going to present is actually setting the foundations to be able to do such a thing, but with a different perspective. Instead of just looking on the impact of social and economic development, we're trying to see the relationship with the strategies of the own countries. So we expect the countries to show themselves in the best possible light, such that we can account for diversity and we can allow for flexibility in the way that we consider the importance of the weights. And we want that to be possible to do simultaneously a ranking as well as an account for specific specificities of the countries. So this is where we started. And in fact, the research that I'm going to show in this presentation has to do with the assessment in a given moment in time, but we expect them to be able to see the evolution over time. And this is again a graph from the Canadian framework, where they, on the horizontal axis, they're saying how the index was in 2010, and then in vertical axis, they're saying if the trend was positive or negative. So this is something that we would also like to do in the future. So in this particular presentation, what I'm going to show, well, I'd like to go to the previous slide, but it went too fast. So the objective is then to compare the performance of EU countries. We want to have this framework of lifelong learning approach, so have different indicators ranging from higher education, childhood education, employment, and all the targets that the EU has set. And we would then like to do this composite indicator that we would be able to explore what changes if we go from a totally fixed weight setting to a more flexible weight setting in which each country sees itself and therefore is ranked, taking into account its own specificities in terms of importance, differences in importances in weights that are seen by individual countries. So we're going from performance measurement to performance management in the sense that we allow for these different strategies, and also we want to provide peers to these evaluations, such that we do a benchmarking, a true benchmarking exercise, saying for whoever is not considered to be on the best ever or in the best performance in the sample, to be able to see who could be, which countries could provide guides for improvement. So, in terms of the literature, how does this relate to the literature? There are several works on the efficiency measurement literature using frontier techniques, which is the same that I'm going to use in this research, that look quite a lot into the efficiency of education systems or at country level. But mainly when they look at education systems, they focus primarily in one of the educational stages, typically secondary education. Sometimes several levels are considered together. So I'm just showing a table here. It's not very easy to see. It's too small. But the idea is to say that in most studies, only secondary education was looked at when the benchmarking exercise was conducted at country level. A few studies have considered primary, secondary, and tertiary, or at least combined two of the educational stages. And in all of them, the perspective was to see how well resources were transformed into outputs, so desirable outputs in terms of achievements. And the techniques in frontier techniques have been DEA and SFA mostly, so non-parametric and as well as parametric techniques, with the advantages and disadvantages that each of them has. And in fact, our idea was to try to use exactly the indicators as they have been set by the European Union and look at this performance with those indicators. So not exactly seeing the transformation of resources into outcomes. And therefore, it's important to clarify that at the end of the day, when we will say this country is the best in terms of the achievements of EU targets, it does not mean that the other countries that are not the best did not do a very good job, because they might have different contexts. But if the idea of European Union is of convergence in countries, we know how far a specific country is from this target of convergence. And it might just indicate that because it's far from the target, it needs additional resources, it needs additional support. Again, it should not be seen these are the beauty countries that behave very well, and those are the ones that don't behave so well. It's just a matter of seeing what efforts must be done in terms of convergence to help those that did not achieve the targets in such a good way compared with the rest of the sample. So, in terms of our methodology, so we're using a benefit of the doubt model. It's quite well known in the literature of non-parametric techniques, frontier techniques. And the idea is to aggregate the indicators. So this is on the formulation that is shown here is the Y symbol representing outputs. And then the U is representing the weight or the importance attached to that weight. And in PDA, we cannot say that the magnitude of the U, the absolute value of the weight represents the importance, because we are aggregating things that are measured in different scales. So we have to be very careful on the way we deal with these importances attached to the indicators. So what we proposed here, and this is innovative in this research, is actually to be able to represent these weights in a way that is easy to be interpreted and it's easy to be accepted by those that are being subjects of evaluation and might not be so much aware of the details of the technical formulation. So the way that we imposed the restrictions was as a share of the importance of a given product of the indicator by its own weight, so that we can here account for the measurement scale. In terms of the total share of the outputs, which is this product of weights and indicators. And this total share, by definition in our model, sums up to 1. So it means we can represent the importance of the indicators in percentage terms, which makes things much, much easier than traditional DEA. So it means that we can say the importance will range between, for example, 0 and 1. If we have an evaluation, as in this case, that we would have 8 indicators. If we have 1/8 of the weight, it means that all indicators would have exactly the same importance in terms of evaluation. So in this case, it would mean a sigma equal to 1 means we have exactly equal weights for all indicators. If we would have a sigma equal to 0, it would mean that the weights can be chosen completely with total freedom by each of the countries. So 0 means total freedom, 1 means total flexibility, in the sense that all indicators should represent the same importance to the countries. So this was our formulation, and then by duality of linear programming, what we reach is a formulation that we can identify the peers. So if a country is not said to be 100% efficient, what were the other countries that dominated it and therefore represent the evidence that they are underperforming? So given this methodology or the way that we've approached the problem, we wanted them to compare with the traditional methodologies that are often used for aggregating weights, which would be, these are mostly inspired on multi-criteria decision analysis. And then the most simple aggregating procedure would be having equal weights and normalizing the data such that then we can aggregate. So we did exactly the same. We did the normalization. We applied the traditional multi-criteria technique with an additive procedure, and we compared what the frontier techniques with these different ranges of flexibility would let us know, and what comes in addition to the traditional techniques. So, in terms of the data and the results that we obtained, the data is in fact what is collected by Eurostat for the targets of the European Union that I've just mentioned. And we had to add to this the PISA information on the low achievers in reading, maths and science. Then we added 2 other indicators which we thought would be important to complement the EU analysis. So this was just, well, an experiment, which we decided to add also PISA top achievers, because it's very important for a country not only to not letting any child behind in terms of educational achievements, but also promote excellence. So this is well known everywhere. So we wanted to give a balanced view on the achievement at 15 years old, considering no one behind, but still excellence is available. So we're not aiming at the middle, we're aiming at being very good. And then the other thing is that we thought that it's also very important the upper secondary attainment. So in terms of the percentage of people aged 25 to 65 who have successfully completed at least upper secondary education. This is becoming more and more an entry level to the working market, and to have a proper job and to have a good educational status, as well as promoting the possibility of having a good job. The secondary education is really the departure point. So we really wanted to include as well the ability of the countries to get a large percentage of their population with at least secondary education. So these are our final sets. So it means we have 8 indicators. Some of them, the lowest is the best, and for others, the highest is the best. So we first made a transformation such that all the indicators would be measured in a way that the highest is the best. And here is just the representation of the statistical variability in terms of EU countries, and in red is the EU target. So we can see that the target is set at a position that we don't know exactly how EU reached those numbers, but some of the countries in 2015 were already better than the target. So again, it's an issue of convergence. EU wants all countries to get at least that number or more. So we could see that a few countries were still lagging in terms of the European strategy in 2015. So what can we then learn in terms of education systems? Again, this is a table that's going to be difficult to read, so I'm going to try to explain what we're trying to do. The first point is just to say, if we just aggregated the indicators, having normalized them first and then giving equal weight to all countries, we will be able to make a ranking. So the ranking is done there, and there we can see exactly what's the best country and what are the worst countries in terms of education achievements. If we use this non-parametric DEA model, so frontier technique, and if we also normalize the data and impose the equal weights in the way that I have proposed the formulation, with the 1/8 of importance to each indicator, we get exactly the same ranking. So the departure point is that in non-parametric techniques, frontier techniques in DEA, we can get exactly the same as in multi-criteria. But then the advantage of DEA is getting peers and targets, as well as allowing for some flexibility. So if we would make some changes to the formulation such that we would not need to normalize data, we need to make also some changes in the implementation of the weight restrictions, but we can see, and that was what the table wanted to show, that we don't have a wide variability, even if we transform everything such that we can then go into managerial insights, and if we can then go into the weights flexibility. So only one country, which was Iceland, varied quite a lot in this ranking, but the ranking was quite stable. So once that we validated the kind of approach that we wanted to use, the idea was to show how the ranking of countries and how their performance varies if we allow for more or less flexibility. And what we conclude is that if we allow total flexibility, then in this case, most countries will be seen as 100% efficient because they have differences in strategies. Some of them will weight more one indicator, another one will weight more another indicator. And therefore, if we have 8 indicators to consider, we have very few discrimination. We can still find some inefficient countries, we can still find evidence for that, but we cannot propose many improvements to the others. If we range the flexibility more, until the fixed weights, we will then have a full ranking. Only one country will be good and all the others will be less good. So considering the variation between these two extremes in the rankings, we can see how much compensation the method is allowing. So if we allow a lot of compensation, if the country, for being very good in one of the indicators, might be not so good in the others and still be good in the ranking, it means that it has an unbalanced performance. And so the last column represented in red indicates that if that red is very large, it means that the performance of the country is very unequal, so it changes a lot depending on the degree of flexibility that we are allowing for the indicator. And we can also see this in a different way, showing the variation for each of the countries in terms of the performance. So the central position for each country represents the median level of performance, where we can see that, for example, Switzerland and Finland are very good. And, for example, Romania is having on average, a level of performance that is lower and also varies a lot if we impose more or less flexibility in the weight. So it means it's unbalanced. Eventually, it's quite good in one or two indicators, but all the other indicators are lagging behind. So this is actually a picture of the education system, and this is where we wanted to get. So we're getting some insights on how we can summarize performance and how that summary of performance would vary so that we have some idea of robustness of these type of rankings. Then, the other issue that we were also interested in exploring was actually the peers and targets. I know that this is probably not very fair to say who's the best and looking at who we should look as examples of best practices, because in this particular case we did not take into account contextual conditions. But of course this is a methodological experiment, and what we know is that we can, instead of using normal DEA as I did here, then do robust DEA or conditional DEA, and then in that case we could condition the performance to the comparison to similar countries. And therefore, if we go from traditional DEA to robust DEA, we would then be able also to identify these targets. So this is just an example to show how we can actually see the targets. And of course, they will vary depending on the degree of flexibility. But even if we do the picture for the different degrees of flexibilities, I'm using here Portugal as an example. So Portugal would represent the central line, the normalized line in black. And then the performance of the peers are the other lines represented with different colors. And here it's still visible that if we would look to other countries, we can see that the indicators that Portugal is lagging behind is on Y2, Y5, and Y8. So it's very easy to visualize, and it's also very easy to say that assuming, for example, we have an intermediate degree of flexibility, so we want all indicators to be taken into account, but still allow for some flexibility for Portugal to weight more the things that Portugal is actually more engaged and considers more important, we can also see exactly who we should learn from. So this is kind of an interesting procedure to try to promote improvement and try to help the definition of policies. If we would then also use this to help guiding the target setting, once we have peers, we also are able to get targets in DEA. And if we would use this approach to get the targets for the European Union, we would get slightly more demanding targets. Here it's not very visible, but the European Union targets that we don't know how they were set are represented in red, and the targets from the EA are represented with different colors. And in most cases, they would be more demanding if we would use the DEA. Then, in terms, so this is just illustrative. Of course, we would expect to do the targets with a more robust approach. So in terms of the conclusions, So what I would like to highlight here is that we developed, or we are proposing a composite indicator to describe educational achievements of countries. But of course, this can also be done at different levels, geographic levels. We can compare regions, for example. It would be equivalent to compare countries in the European Union setting to compare regions, for example, in a Russian setting. And illustrate how weight restrictions can play a role, so how we can actually value the importance of the indicators in a way that those that are evaluated feel it as a fair assessment to account for differences in the strategies and for differences in the views of the importance of the different indicators. Then we would also like to show that it's important to measure performance not just for controlling, but then for promoting improvements, so for trying to get better managerial insights. And in terms of future work, I think that, well, the most important things of conferences is to share ideas and share proposals. So here, what I would like to say is that what comes next? I think that what comes next is actually looking at the evolution of performance over time, which in the Canadian case that they were showing the map on the colors of the performance achievements, they were also saying how the trends are evolving. It's a very good country, but it is actually coming from an increase in performance trends, so it's probably going to be even better in the future, or a declining trend, so it's in risk of losing its benchmark position. We also want to go into a more detailed regional level. So even at the European space, we realize that the information on ET targets is available by regions. So we want to do this at regional level. And we also have collected already data on contextual conditions, such that we can do a conditional DEA model for this setting. And finally, just to give an idea, well, this on the future work, this is just a graph. Well, this work that I presented here is already published, so please feel free to contact me if you would like to have more details. It's also available, the paper in Tommazo Agasisti came this year, so in 2019. And just giving an insight on visualizations. So for example, this graph is just showing how in 2015, the performance in terms of achievement, the ET targets was in terms of the European space. So if all targets were achieved, we have the orange color, so we can see only 2 countries actually achieved all targets, and then when we're going into the purple, we can see the ones that are lagging behind in terms of achievement, and we can see Eastern countries, and Portugal, unfortunately, is also in a purple color. And we looked at trends as well, and in 3 year periods. So we are looking both at efficiency assessment in 4 different points in time, as well as trends with the Mount-West Index. So this is what is going to come next. And also the regional scale, trying to get into more detail, not just country level, such that with the regional scale we can take into account contextual conditions, which we have not done so far. So these are just ideas for the future that I would like to share with you. So thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you, Аны. The floor is open for questions, comments.
Maybe I have just one question to clarify, because one thing was not completely clear to me. So in your model, you have this a kind of parameter that define the level of flexibility of weights, right?
Exactly.
And what I haven't got is, so you have presented the results and rankings for different values of these parameters, and so how to obtain, kind of final ranking using this methodology? So how can we find the optimal value of this parameter sigma, or what is the idea of this parameter? How can we change it?
In fact, again, this is a management science kind of worldview. And in management science, we tend to say that it's important to decide based on data, and we cannot use the data to make the decision. And in that sense, the idea is to make available all this information, such that if I would have to say what's your final ranking, I would say I have to take it, I will go back to the graph if I manage. I would have said that I don't want to fix one point and say what is perfect. I would have said that in terms of ranking, I should give the average position and then variability. So that was the graph that I was trying to show with the median position and variability. So in terms of ranking, I would probably consider the overall image, how much on average the result is high, and if the variability is low, that's the best country. If I would have to choose only one position, I would probably choose an intermediate position. I would not get the totally fixed weights, not the total flexible weights, so I would get somewhere in between where the variation stabilizes more or less. So then I would look at the numbers and see what's the best, which is more or less the same as we do in cluster analysis. We tend to see what is the ideal number of clusters that we should consider. It is when getting an additional cluster would not change very much the type of the groups. So here I would say it's an empirical way of seeing what's the best number, or a managerial insight that would tell us I want to position myself in a totally rigid system or not. So I would say we would not optimize within the optimization. So we would provide different numbers and not try to say which one is the best.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if we can, we actually had a lot of comments on that with John and David in the past, but there is something on which I would like to have your reflection. I like very much, of course, the work, but the use of country-level data is always or often criticized. I did a lot in the past of this work, but the main argument that people criticize when we talk about country-level data is that two issues. The first one is that you are putting together, you are merging together very different and very heterogeneous situations. So when you say, for example, the primary education performance is that one, actually, this is the average of a lot of heterogeneity within country. The second is, it is something very innovative in your paper, but even a little bit brave, that is, you are trying to putting together all the educational level, right? So when you look at the performance, at a certain point, it is the result of, say, primary, secondary, and tertiary education mixed together. You're not able to disentangle this contribution. So if you have to make a policy conclusion on that, you are not able to say you must improve that thing or that thing because you don't know if it is due to, primary or secondary or tertiary education. That's a reflection I would stimulate for you.
I could be more aligned with your reflection. So when I was saying future work is regional level, you can see we're following on your suggestion. And we fully agree, yes, the data is also available at regional level for the European Union, so we can go on that. The other issue is that in terms of, for example, we know here with the graphs, with the radar charts, where the actually weaker points are. So what I think that could complement this is that we can add this overview on countries or whatever regions' performance with detailed analysis, and then here I think efficiency would make a lot of sense. For example, saying I'm going to pick secondary education, then I'm going to pick basic education, and that's the tradition in the literature. And this can only be a full perspective on the country if we complement this overall assessment with a detailed assessment. So for example, here for Portugal, we would say we have a problem in lifelong learning, for example, in particular. If we could see exactly how much we invest, is it the problem that we don't have enough inputs or we have so we should then look at detailed analysis that would complement this. Absolutely. Because we are never able to act if we don't know the details. So if this provides an overview and this is kind of information for convergence at EU level, then we have to provide more detailed information for managers in the country level. And then that will be a separate thing, looking at different stages, educational stages, looking at regions. So I think this is just a starting point. Okay. It's just for, like in the Canada analysis, they wanted to start with an overview of lifelong learning, but then they say we cannot get only a picture at national level because lifelong learning is an engagement of national policies and local policies. So it's not enough to say how the country behaves because the action has to be done locally. So here is the thing, all these issues have to be acted. For example, childhood education is clearly a local issue normally and financed locally. We would then need to see how performance in that level is doing, and so I think we will follow with your suggestions. Indeed, we are following on the individual areas, stages of education, as well as regional analysis.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna, for the presentation. It's very interesting, especially interesting to know that scholars are working on developing models of evaluation of outcomes, not just from the formal perspective, but also evaluation of cognitive outcomes, and maybe even non-cognitive outcomes of learning. So my question is about consideration of the outcomes that cannot be measured straight after students are graduating from university. So outcomes that are, for example, delayed, outcomes that are unforeseen, either positive or negative. So have you considered the way of looking at these kind of outcomes that learning obviously have on economic society, and how do you have any ideas how this can be measured or included into the evaluation tool?
I think that once again, I am more in the area of quantitative methods, but even in these rules of the quantitative measurement, for example, the rules of data development analysis were actually on education, and one of the outputs that they were measuring was student self-esteem. So that's clearly the case that you're saying. It's very important for any quantitative study to look at exactly what's happening afterwards and how much of non-immediately measured things we are taking into account. So I would say that the challenge is for us that work on quantitative methods to have this done alongside people from psychology and from economics to get the proper indicator to represent those realities. So I would say this research on quantitative things can never be separated from the other type of research. And even in quantitative issues, for example, one of the recent work that I've done with colleagues in Porto, and that was only in Portugal, so the Portuguese team, we're trying to evaluate secondary schools. And we're trying to evaluate secondary schools getting out of the tradition, which is exactly how students perform on exams, or if they have eventually volunteering engagement during secondary education, and see how they perform in higher education. And we're using the values of higher education performance to then aggregate a group of students from the same school and then measure the school performance. So sometimes it's possible if we try to get a few years ahead, pick exactly the same people and then measure the performance of the original phases of education based on future achievements. So we have done that to account for those lags.
The work is going, right?
The work is already published. It was again published in 2019 in Omega, which is the International Journal of Management Science. And it's on ranking of secondary schools based on university achievements. So I would say we are very much worried about this type of non-immediately measured issues and issues that have a lag in the future. It's definitely a very important topic.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
I think it's the time for the second presenter.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity of presenting this work today. This is ongoing work, so please feel free to send comments and suggestions and whatever at the end. It is difficult to present after the brilliant presentation of Anna in this work. It is already well done. This is something that is very much at the beginning of its development. So what we do here is we try to evaluate the productivity and efficiency of Chinese and European universities, and especially we focus on a certain group of universities that we call in first approximation world-class. It is probably better to say elite universities in each country, but then I will go more in detail about which kind of universities we are targeting here to be compared. Our paper moves from the observation that there is, a great attention of policymakers in many countries to try to create the ones that are called world-class universities. So where the idea is these countries can compete also on the basis of their higher education system, and especially they compete on the basis of the top players in their higher education system. So you must have something like institutions that are able to, I would say, compete with other universities on a global scale, And the policymakers say, okay, we need a tool, or we need some ways to try to stimulate the existence and presence of these universities in our country. So if we accept, I'm not saying at all that it is a good thing, by the way. I'm just observing what the governments are doing, and which is the political debate around this topic. And the political rationale which is behind certain kinds of initiatives that try to foster the performance of certain universities. However, assuming that it is the field, that it is the landscape of higher education in many countries today, if we observe the way in which these so-called world-class universities work, what they do is basically they compete on the basis of their prestige, that in many cases mean on the basis of the quality and quantity of the outputs they produce. So they are universities that are very well reputed in terms of excellence in teaching, research, and transmission, whatever it means, excellence. But the idea is, okay, once we define a certain standard of what the excellence is, and how excellent is a reputation, then these universities are focusing their attention in trying to maximize the quality of those outputs that are able to make these universities excellent. This is not only the incentive for a single institution, it is also an incentive that works at institutional level. One of the most interesting policy levers moved by the governments in the past years have been the creation of policies devoted to, create this group of world-class universities in different countries. In this country, you know very well the 5 to 100 project, which is a typical example of a policy aiming at developing a world-class universities. But we have very similar policies in Germany, that actually was the first country that purposely created an initiative for fostering excellent universities, and then in China and France and in other countries as well. So there is not only just a single university incentive to behave like that, but there is a strong action of the governments trying to create specific policies for this purpose. Now, if we ask to scholars working in this field what is a world-class university, we will obtain a lot of answers. The main purpose of this paper is not to create an accepted definition of world-class university, but to state a general concept that they used for trying to pick up from two different areas of the world a group of universities that can be compared. So according to Salmi, in this report that he wrote for the World Bank, a world-class university is an institution in which there is a concentration of talents, both among students and professors, an abundance of resources. There's a lot of money that can be spent for the core activities of the university, and federal governance, meaning autonomy, or at least a special status that make the university able to combine their available resources in an effective way. If we accepting this definition can require a lot of discussion. It is not a place to going with that. As I said before, our big problem was not to make a perfect definition of world-class university. Our big problem was to identify a set of world-class universities in these two different areas. So we used a simple shortcut, and then we tried to give a sense of why we went in that direction. That is to look at the rankings. I'm not trying to convince you that the rankings are a good thing. I'm not convinced by myself. But in any case, in the way in which the policy system works today is we can assume that if a university establishes top ranked in one of the top rankings, it can be defined or labeled as a world-class university. It has a world-class prestige, has a global reputation. It is something that we wanted to analyze. So we know that there are different rankings available to make this exercise. At the end of the day, we went with the Times Higher Education as a choice for that, for several reasons that if you want, I can go more in detail about. But it is not making such a big difference, the one that we use if we want to pick the top level universities in the different countries. The motivation for this paper is that all these universities compete on the basis of output. They don't have a strong and clear incentive to operate in an efficient way. So to be on the top of rankings, to be on the top of reputation, saying you must produce quality and quantity of outputs, but it can be the case that actually they, spend a lot of money for getting these results, and it can be definitely the case that they spend much more than it is necessary to get that level of performance. So it can be the case that having all the attention focused on output will lead them to underestimate the importance of using the resources in an efficient way. So here we want to provide a different viewpoint on these universities that are usually discussed in terms of their outputs, and we want to say, well, but let's look if they are also able to produce efficiently. So, well, one concern that was raised by a scholar when I presented this a few weeks ago, one very clever person said to me, well, but these universities are not concerned with efficiency. They usually have a lot of money. So why would you like to have a study looking at their efficiency if they don't care about that? And my answer for that is that many of these universities, especially in Europe and China, are strongly funded by public sector. So I don't know if these universities are caring about that, but as a citizen, as a taxpayer, I do care about that. And I do care about the fact that these universities are not only maximizing the output, which is the key expectation we have for them, but also that they are doing with the best ability they have to do that in an efficient way. So we move from the observation that these universities conduct a race to the top, which is expensive. And we don't want to say they should spend less. Our question is just to see if they are doing it in a way which is maximizing the output given the inputs that they have. And to the extent to which we find that there is an ability to expand their output given the inputs they have, it can also result in better results for these universities as well. Why we decided to focus on two different areas of the world? Well, basically because world-class university by name itself is a global phenomenon. So to the extent to which these universities are compared across their performance, we also feel that if we want to look at the efficiency story, it is also necessary to look at the efficiency story in an international comparison. Being clearly aware of the difficulty, I will show you something, that we have in comparing universities that come from such different areas. And why China and why Europe? Well, because I think in general terms, the areas that can be compared are basically four, so US, Australia, China, and Europe. And I think that Russia will do the scheme into the analysis of what is going to be, the results of the policy you have at national level here. But here, the China and Europe, Europe has a long tradition of global universities, that compete worldwide. And China, like Russia, by the way, is one of the areas of the world which is investing a lot of money to try to build these, world-class universities, and then we want to see if we can compare them. There is some excellent work done by some colleagues that try to compare the European and the US ones, and we try to complement that work, having in mind the dream of the future, which is trying to put all this information together and providing a more global view. This can be also part of work we are doing here at the lab at the Irish School of Economics. Okay, so these are the two questions we try to answer in this paper. So the first one is, how is the relative efficiency of Chinese and European world-class universities? And we also wanted to see the evolution of this efficiency in the period between 2011 and 2015. I already tried to say which are the main innovation of the paper. One innovation that I will mention more when I will go through the technicalities about methodology is that in this paper we use, of course, a frontier approach to assess the efficiency, but what we try to do is to use a meta-frontier approach to try to keep into account that the two groups of universities can have some structural differences that must be taken into account when defining their performance indicator, their efficiency. I will skip the literature, but it is because I think I don't have time to go in details through that, but in the paper, the working paper, you will find some discussion. Just to mention that we, follow basically three streams. The first one is about the university efficiency in a cross-national perspective, so the ability of comparing universities in different countries. And the second one is about international rankings of universities, so providing a justification that it is not necessary that we believe the rankings, it is necessary that we know that the rankings are used by policymakers for a lot of purposes, including the one of promoting excellence across universities. And the third stream is about the concepts and characteristics of world-class universities to make an argument that we are able to identify them by using the shortcut of looking at the rankings. So let me say just a few words about the data and methodology, and then I will show very quickly the results. I know, but it is because I also know that I have a lot of things to say about the data So the first challenge we had was to find comparable data and to find data at all, I would say. So first of all, we selected the world-class universities. We had, for the European case, we chose to include all the universities that were ranked several times between 2011 and 2019 among the first Times higher education institutions. And then we ended up with 50 universities that were ranked in the top 100 in Europe for 7 times in that period of time. So it is just to avoid that a university speak because in a specific year is there. So we search those that consistently are ranked across the first top 100 European universities in Times higher education. For the Chinese group, the system doesn't work, and so because there is not such a big number of universities ranked so many times in Times higher ed, so what we did is we pick among the first, tiers of the Times higher education, all the universities that were ranked from China in that list, and we ended up with 40. It is not European, of course, it is Chinese universities. Then we started the collection of data. For Europe, we used the European Tertiary Education Register. It is a public available data set created by the European Commission some years ago. And for China, we used the compilation of science and technology statistics of higher education institutions provided by the Ministry of Education. Of course, the big challenge is to have a model of efficiency and productivity that can be somehow compared. And we went to a very simple production model for 2 reasons. The first one is that the most complicated indicators you put there, the most complicated would be the comparison across the institution. Second thing is I generally love these clear, simple models because I know that they are not perfect, but even the most complicated are not perfect at all. And but when they are simple, it is simple to be understood. And I think it is a very good thing when you have to discuss this with policymakers. And by the way, something like I really appreciate the Anna's first presentation, in which you showed these are the indicators, and everyone was understood, right? We can complicate this a lot, and then we don't understand nothing, right? So the idea is to go to a very simple comparison here, and a simple comparison in which we try to give a sense of how a university works. And so the idea is that the universities have 2 basic inputs. So they have expenditures for current expenditures, so all the expenditures that go for research and development, teaching and operations, and academic staff, so the full-time personnel, the permanent staff that they use for teaching and research. What they do produce with these resources is basically 3 things. And, 3 things for which we have comparable data. And these are the number of students, and we chose to pick the students in the ICSED classification 6-8, so bachelor, master, and PhD. The number of papers published in the Web of Science, and we also inserted there an indicator of quality of output, or supposed quality of output, and we used the normalized citation impact, so to give a sense of how much the work what words are cited by people from that university. So that's more or less our production model we have in mind. What is interesting, in my view, is to look at some descriptive differences between inputs and outputs for the European and Chinese universities. Now you see that, well, here there are some things that I want to show you. These are just average values. Distributions are interesting as well, but just to give it the averages. So for example, you see that in terms of expenditure, European universities spend on average much more than Chinese universities. Chinese universities have much more academic staff. European universities, on average, have much more students in each institution. And so you see, all these factors are going in different directions in terms of efficiency, right? Because if you think of the efficiency as the ratio between, the output and the input, but then you see there's a still huge difference in terms of outputs, research outputs, both in terms of publications and in terms of citation. So here, descriptively, it's very difficult to say what system is more productive, because one is costing more, is employing less people, and is producing more. But the other, is spending less, is employing more people, and produce a little bit less. So empirically, it is difficult to define just descriptively which system is likely to be more efficient. And by the way, remember, we are not comparing two institutions, we are comparing different institutions in the same country, okay? In different countries. So this is something that I graphically represent, and whether some interesting trend over time. So here is, for example, the current expenditures in millions euro purchasing power parity in the two groups of universities. So this is the average, current expenditure per each institution. So you see that there is something like a parallel trend until a certain moment, and then in the last year, for which we have data, we are not sure we can say it is a change or it is something like just a single year change. What is more illustrative, in my view, is the trends about publications. So you see, the average Chinese institution, elite institution, is something like catching up. So this is something that in the future would be super nice to see what is happening here, right? Okay, so a few words about the methodology. In this paper, we tried to combine meta-frontier with dynamic evaluation of efficiency. So we basically used a non-parametric meta-frontier. I will tell you a few words about the meta-frontiers in a second. But then we combined this with a Marquis productivity index, in which you want to see the evolution of productivity over time. So what is a meta-frontier? Meta-frontier, simply put, is when you make an efficiency analysis, you don't assume that you have a single frontier for all the observations. So you're not assuming all the universities are using the same technology. You're not assuming that it is possible to define a one-size-fits-all frontier of efficient units. What you say is that, okay, let's imagine there are key groups of different institutions. So these groups are structurally different. So we can compare them, and we must compare them once we have taken this structural difference into consideration. So here, of course, the two groups are Chinese versus European universities. So what we did basically is very simple. We built a frontier for the Chinese universities, we built a frontier for the European universities, and then we built an international frontier which is enveloping both frontiers, right? So for each institution, you can compare the distance from the frontier of efficient units nationally and globally. And then, of course, you can try to understand how distant is the frontier of a group from the international frontier. But that's not only what we did, because this is a simple meta-frontier thing. We added the fact that we look at the evolution over time. So over time, the Chinese frontier changes, the European frontier changes, the international frontier changes, and so the relative position of each university changes with respect to its frontier, to the international frontier, to the change of the frontiers. Okay? So in more structural terms, what we did is we assumed that for each group, we have a reference set which is composed by the contemporaneous technology set, so the frontier of efficient units of that group in a specific period of time. There is the intertemporal technology set, so the variation over time of the frontier for a specific group. And then we have the global technology set, which is the global frontier, right? And then, of course, we have the global change of the frontier. Mathematically, it's very simple. We can define for each institution the technical efficiency in a period and its change in 2 periods, with reference to its own frontier. We can define the best practice gap as the difference between the contemporaneous frontier, the distance between the contemporaneous frontier and its own intertemporal frontier. So how the frontier moves over time. So the technical progress of each group over time. And then we can compare the technology gap ratio as the distance between the technology of a group, so the frontier of a group and the frontier of the other group, and its change over time. Okay? So that's the measure we can have for each institution. We try to make I would say, a picture of these universities, European versus Chinese, according to these measures of productivity. And of course, the real productivity is the product of these 3 measures. Okay? So what we want to do is to try to disentangle the productivity change between the beginning of the period and the end of the period by understanding if this changing productivity is due because it becomes more efficient, it is because its frontier moves more efficiently, it is because the relative frontier moves in a different way. Okay? So, these are the results. So, what you have to observe here is the synthetic index on the last column on the right. Okay? So if it is higher than 1, it means that there is a productivity growth. This is all the universities together. Okay? So assuming everything them together. So what you see there is that on average, in the period under scrutiny, there was an increase of around 5.6% of productivity. But there is a declining trend over time. So if you see there, the increase in productivity was much higher in the first years and then started to decline. The last year, there was no increase in productivity at all. What is determining this productivity is growth, is 2 elements. First of all is the efficiency, the column that is called AC. So universities are improving their efficiency over time. Their technical efficiency. They are able to transform inputs into outputs at a higher rate over time. And then the second one is the technical change over time. So frontiers are moving in a positive direction. So the technology of both groups are improving over time and are contributing to the productivity. But if you look at the technology gap ratio, this is stable. So what it means here is that there is not there is not a contribution coming from a different shape of the 2 frontiers over time. So the 2 frontiers are not changing over time in their relative position. So they are increasing, they're both increasing, but there is not change in their relative position. If we look at the same results by separating European and Chinese universities, so for example, this is the story for the Chinese group of universities. So, in this case, the growth of productivity is higher than the average. There is a very strong efficiency change. There is a very strong movement of the efficient frontier. But then the technology gap ratio, so the evolution of the frontier over time with respect to the global frontier, is not experiencing a good thing. So it's basically there. Actually, it declines a little bit. When we look at the European universities, the story is the other side of the coin. So still an increase in productivity, 4.5%, but it comes just from the technology production, so the frontier is moving. The frontier is moving positively, meaning that these universities are increasing their technology of production, but their technical efficiency, so the ability of transforming inputs into outputs, is pretty stagnant. So they are not increasing their efficiency over time. The last point I want to show you is the demonstration that, so here we have the plot about the technology gap ratio here, right? So how are distributed the universities with respect to the international frontier? And what you see here is that there is a high density for the European universities on the left side, that most of them are actually building the international frontier. So if we look at the international frontier, we see a lot of European universities that are very close to the international frontier, and many Chinese universities are pretty far from the international frontier. So the technology gap ratio is saying something like, there was, and still there is at the end of the period, a distance between the best production ability of the European universities and the best production ability of the Chinese universities. So they moved in the same direction in terms of productivity, but there was a gap that is still there at the end. Very policy implication for our paper. So let me just clarify a couple of things that are useful to remind at the end of the presentation. First one is, we are measuring efficiency change. So we are not measuring efficiency overall. We are not measuring performance overall. We are measuring how these universities change their efficiency over time. And we are looking at some relative efficiency. So relative because we have these two groups of universities. I don't know if you put the US universities, what happens here. It can be the case that actually the international frontier is done by the US universities, and then there is a different positioning of European and Chinese. But in any case, we don't know. We just provide a relative picture of the two. How can universities improve the productivity based on our results? We identified two different avenues for the two groups. So for the Chinese universities, the challenge is to reduce technology gap. So they are increasing. As you saw, you see the increase in performance is happening, at least in the number of publications. But the problem is, it is also increasing the inputs. So somehow they have to understand how to close the technology gap with the European universities. So they must find a way to produce, as a group, more outputs and to try to fill the gap they still have with the ability of European universities to lead the international measures. And for the European universities, however, there is an alarm as well. That is, if those guys are not able to make a more efficient use of resources, so the technical efficiency will remain stagnant over time, it is pretty easy that after a while, when there will be a technology gap better for the Chinese universities, it is the case that we'll be able to reach the level of productivity of the European ones and fill in this gap. So European universities must find a way to try to use their resources more efficiently, because this gap is not, something that can remain forever, and it is very much dependent on the ability you have in using your resources for producing the output. I think that's all. As I said, it is just work which is ongoing, and so really please send comments and suggestions after today's seminar. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Tommaso. We have some time for questions and comments.
I would like to pay attention on the motivation of this research. So you said that universities are funded mostly by the government, and therefore the public should care about how efficient the money is spent. But, and when we say, so you imply that the public should care, but when we are talking about the European universities, so there are 40 universities you are studying.
50, yeah.
50. And how many of them are from the UK and from continental? continental part of Europe, because I would say that Anglo-Saxon universities, they are funded by a different way, let's say. There are more students that pay for their education tuition fees, there are more private agencies in the UK rather than in other universities, other European universities. And I guess that in your sample of European universities, this sample consists mostly from the British universities.
Yeah.
So that would be like feasible to see the statistics on the how many.
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely.
We can maybe tell a different story about is it applicable to Europe rather than the UK or continental? Because as you said, the aggregated data sometimes is not very good for you to.
Absolutely.
And when we're talking about when we measure those frontiers and you show the numbers in this is declining trend, but there are only 4 periods, and it doesn't seem convenient that this trend is declining rather than just fluctuation. So let's say the universities might have some long-term funded projects that take that they spend a lot of money on those projects, and therefore they are not as effective in one period, but then they will be more effective in, like, let's say, 3 years once this project finishes. So, like declining trend or rather than fluctuation.
Yeah. I go directly with each question, right? So thank you very much. So with the motivation, I partially agree with you. Well, in the paper there is an annex which is showing the complete list of universities, everything with the scores, with the data and so on. So I will send it to you if you want, and any comment on that would be great. I would say that 1/3 of universities are British in that list. And also for that 1/3, I'm not totally sure that your argument applies. So it applies, but what we know from that university is that they have a lot of money coming from students as fees. But then my parents' role come into the picture and say, well, but yes, still it is public interest that the money of students is spent in an efficient way. But then, also, you must consider that for everything that regards the research, and there's a lot of money, comes from the public sector. So I definitely think that governments, when looking at these universities, must try to avoid this crazy error of funding a race to the top, which is not informed by information about how well this money is spent. Because I don't know what will happen in society when we understand that those guys are spending much more money than they should or they could, irrespective they come from fees or whatever, or public funding, because they want to be on top of these rankings, right? So we want to provide an instrument to the government, which is saying, okay, it's good to have good performance, but it is also good to put them, well, give them some incentive, some idea that you're looking at the way in which they are using their resources. Because at the end of the day, no one of those institutions is a company. They don't have their shareholders to answer to. They have the government and the public and the society as the ultimate stakeholder they have to respond to. At least this is my view of the, totally in favor of autonomy of management and whatever. But the second point about the declining trend is absolutely true. We just have 4 years for periods of time, so it is very difficult to say, well, in the descriptive statistics, to talk about fluctuations versus declining trends. This is a little bit more robust when we look at the method for calculating the productivity growth or not. Because in that case, we're trying to disentangling the, input to output ratio. So we're not just looking at single numbers. We are putting together inputs and outputs. So what you observe is not fluctuation in single numbers. It is the evolution of a measure which is taking into account changes in inputs and outputs in different years. So in that case, I would be, safer to say that what we observed in the last years is that efficiency is a little bit stagnant. But I don't know if it is because of a declining trend in funding or it is a fluctuation in funding. I'm not able to say that. We must be very careful to say that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. There's a couple of quick questions. The first one is, so you explained that you use like a different methodology to choose like a European versus Chinese universities for the data. I don't know if you have tried to be like more restricted with the Chinese universities, but I don't know, do like a certain threshold, like may not be 7 times in the rankings, but maybe 3 or 4 times, and see how your results change with a more restricted sample of Chinese universities. My second question is towards, and I don't know if it's easy related to learning about possible structural differences between the European system and the Chinese system. Like an example that comes to my mind is okay, maybe it's not that the Chinese universities are less efficient, but for example, if a Chinese professor is expected to spend more time with their students, then like you have less time for research, and it's not that the system, it's not that the Chinese university is less efficient, it's just that they have different expectations or they work in different ways. But I don't know if there's anything you can do about this.
Thank you. So starting from the second, which is easier from a methodological point of view, it would be super difficult to try to include structural specific differences. So this is exactly why we decided to go for the meta-frontier approach. So in the meta-frontier approach, you assume that there are structural differences, and so the shape of the international frontier is taking into account structural differences across the two groups of universities. So it is something like you're not forcing universities to, oh, Fiat Lux, you're not forcing universities to be, classified according to a uniform production process. And actually, in our view, the distance between the frontier of Chinese and the frontier of European it is representing the extent and the magnitude of these structural differences. And maybe it would be interesting in the future to try to characterize this difference and this difference of time. The first one, I'm not sure I understand what is behind your question, but if I understood correctly, the point is, okay, the Chinese universities, so I don't understand if it is a question like you have different numbers of universities in Europe and China, or Chinese universities are not so world-class.
Yeah, I mean, that's my concern.
Yeah.
You're like putting like really world-class European versus
exactly.
a group of Chinese that are maybe not so world-class.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. This will be the major change we'll have in the paper in the next few weeks, following the comment I had in a past conference that I totally agree with. And it is world-class university is creating an image in all of us, which is very different from the elite universities in China we are considering here. So I don't know if we can consider Peking University a world-class, maybe yes. I don't know if we can consider Tsinghua a world-class university, maybe yes. But apart of these two, I don't think there is a real world-class university in the sense in which we are considering the others. I mean the international exposure and blah, blah. So what we are doing is we will change the frame of the argument into the elite universities in countries. I don't think it in general terms of incentives to the system changes that much, because at the end it is still the university, the governments want to push them to be on the top of that and eventually engage in international comparison. But at least from a formal and methodological point of view, we are talking something which is much more comparable with the elite universities in Europe that eventually are much more world-class. And these are Chinese universities, elite universities that are still elite, but not all of them are so world class.
Thank you, Alex. We have time for one short question.
Thank you for the presentation, very interesting. I would like to ask something about the issue on the meta-frontier.
Yeah.
Because the technology gap, I understand that is how far each of the frontier is from the global frontier, and I understand the evolution of the technology gap, saying how the differences of individual frontiers evolve in relation to the meta-frontier.
Yeah.
Can we have something that will compare the two frontiers to each other? Because they might cross, and we might say that the gap is not changing in relation to the overall frontier, but we don't really have a measure saying how much one of the groups is above the other. I was wondering if that is possible, to actually provide something that is just saying one in relation to the other, how far they are, not exactly to the
international.
Because we might not need to have an internet. We only have two groups. We might not need to have the meta-frontier. We might have just the two frontiers.
Yeah, well, we might have two frontiers to the extent, so it would be legitimate to have two different frontiers and not the international one. Only in the case you assume that there is an area of the production function which is covered by one country but not by another. Correct? So the point is, you imagine the two frontiers, right? They overlap. And then you say, well, I'm interested in this relative position that I like very much as a company. They will reflect on that. But what is relevant for me is to say, okay, but to the extent that there is a portion of the efficiency space which is not covered, so they intersect, but there is an area which is not covered by one of the two, it is a structural difference that is saying, okay, there is no possibility for production for that specific university because it belongs to one group, and so there is no space for production for that group in this area, which is something I don't believe, I don't want to believe. So I believe that there is something you can envelop as a meta. This is exactly the idea of the meta-frontier. Right? Because we can cover the space of production set, but...
So that's exactly the point then, if they are together and if there are some overlaps, to quantify also...
Yeah, this can be, I guess this can be done. But it can be done having in mind the shape of the international frontier. So you can provide probably a relative positioning, but still having that benchmark, otherwise you cannot build the frontier, basically, because they are two separate estimations.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you for your presentations, Tommazo, Аны, and for your questions and participation. So we have 20 minutes coffee break, and for those who are not so tired, please come back.
No one is tired, come on.
Yeah. And we will have 3 more presentations, more devoted to Russian case studies in efficiency and performance evaluation. Thank you.